You think you know The Little Mermaid, the charming Disney animated classic about a vibrant young mermaid who dreams of life on land, the fairy tale about true love, transcending boundaries, the heartwarming story of a girl finding her voice. But what you know is a carefully constructed lie, a deliberate sanitization of one of the most deeply personal chronicles of psychological anguish, forbidden desire, and suicidal ideation in literary history. The Little Mermaid wasn't created as a children's story. It was a coded confession of tortured, impossible love, a suicide note disguised as a fairy tale. Hans Christian Andersen didn't write his 1837 tale to delight children. He wrote it as a devastating letter to Edvard Collin, the man who rejected his romantic advances, a man who would never love him back in the way Andersen desperately desired. The original mermaid didn't win her prince. She didn't defeat the sea witch. She dissolved into sea foam, having failed to make the object of her devotion recognize her sacrifice. The physical agony the mermaid endures, described by Andersen as feeling like walking on sharp knives with every step, wasn't random fairy tale cruelty. It was Andersen's own psychological torment made manifest. His queer identity in a society that would never accept it, transformed into visceral physical suffering. The Danish Royal Archives contain the letters between Andersen and Collin, correspondence that scholars have pored over for decades, yet whose full implications remain deliberately obscured in mainstream discussions of the beloved tale. In one letter to Collin, dated 1835, just 2 years before publishing The Little Mermaid, Andersen wrote, "I languish for you as for a pretty Calabrian wench. My sentiments for you are those of a woman. The femininity of my nature and our friendship must remain a mystery." Collin's response was cool, distant, rejecting. Shortly thereafter, Andersen began work on the story of a creature who transforms her body through terrible pain to enter a world where she fundamentally doesn't belong, all for a love that would never be returned. Picture Copenhagen in the 1830s, the narrow cobblestone streets, the flickering gas lamps, the rigid social hierarchies. Andersen, the awkward, gangly son of a washerwoman and a shoemaker, had somehow penetrated the upper echelons of society through his storytelling talent. But he remained an outsider, his mannerisms too effeminate, his emotions too raw, his declarations of love to other men too explicit for the Victorian sensibilities of the time. In his journal, discovered in the Royal Danish Library's archives in 1975, Andersen wrote of being a strange plant, cut off from its roots, a creature belonging to one world while desperately trying to live in another. The mermaid's physical transformation is particularly revealing when examined through this lens. In Andersen's original manuscript, the sea witch doesn't simply take the mermaid's voice as payment for human legs. The description is far more violent. She will cut out your tongue, and in payment, she gets your beautiful voice. This mutilation represents more than a plot device. It's a metaphor for the silencing of one's true identity. Andersen couldn't speak his truth openly. The mermaid's silence reflects his own, rendered mute about his deepest desires, in a society where homosexuality was not merely taboo but criminalized. The original text describes the mermaid's new human legs with disturbing precision. It felt as if sharp knives were passing through her delicate feet, yet she bore it willingly and stepped as lightly by the prince's side as a soap bubble. This isn't the sanitized pain of later adaptations. This is graphic, continuous torture as the price for existing in a world where one doesn't naturally belong. Danish literary historian Victor Norton noted in his 2002 analysis that the vivid description of physical agony serves as a thinly veiled representation of the psychological suffering Andersen experienced in his hopeless romantic pursuits. The mermaid endures this agony silently, smiling through her pain, just as Andersen maintained a cheerful public persona, while his private letters and diaries revealed profound depression. But the parallels between Andersen's life and his most famous creation go deeper still. The mermaid's ultimate fate, dissolution into sea foam, after failing to win the prince's love, was Andersen's greatest fear, disappearing without having ever been truly seen. In his personal papers, preserved in the Hans Christian Andersen Museum in Odense, Denmark, he repeatedly expressed fear that despite his literary success, he would die without experiencing genuine love. "I often feel as though I am dissolving," he wrote in an 1833 journal entry, "becoming nothing more than froth on the sea of humanity, having passed through life without leaving the impression of my true self on anyone." The sea witch herself deserves special attention in unraveling this dark tapestry. Unlike Disney's flamboyant Ursula, Andersen's witch is described with clinical precision, a large and fat creature with slimy brood that she calls her children, which she clutches to her flabby bosom. She represents the natural order that the mermaid defies, not evil, but amoral and indifferent to human suffering. The witch doesn't trick the mermaid. She explicitly warns her of the consequences of her choice. Your tail will divide and shrink until it becomes what humans call nice legs. But it will hurt. It will feel as if a sharp sword sliced through you. Everyone who sees you will say you are the most graceful human being they have ever seen. But every step you take will feel like walking on sharp knives. The witch offers truth without comfort, much like the harsh reality Andersen faced about his unrequited love. Contemporary audiences would have recognized something profound in the mermaid's physical transformation. In 19th century Denmark, folklore around mermaids wasn't merely whimsical. These creatures represented dangerous liminality, beings trapped between worlds. Professor Maria Tatar of Harvard University notes in her analysis the annotated classic fairy tales that merfolk in Nordic tradition were often associated with doomed love and tragic transformation. The mermaid's decision to physically alter herself would have resonated as an act of profound transgression against natural order, a metaphor that had specific significance in a society where deviation from sexual norms was considered not just immoral, but monstrous. The prince's failure to recognize the mermaid's sacrifice forms the story's devastating core. Despite her constant presence, despite her silent devotion, despite dancing for him, though each time her feet touched the floor, it seemed as if she were treading on sharp knives. He never sees her true nature or comprehends her pain. Instead, he marries another, telling the mermaid, "You will rejoice at my happiness, for you love me more than anyone does." This cruel misrecognition mirrors Edvard Collins' response to Andersen's emotional declarations. In a letter dated 1836, Collin wrote to Andersen, "Your friendship is dear to me, though I cannot return your sentiments in kind. You must temper your emotions and remember the proper distance between men of good standing." Just as the prince sees the mermaid only as a devoted friend, Collin refused to acknowledge the romantic nature of Andersen's feelings. The mermaid's sisters appear in a haunting midnight scene, having sacrificed their beautiful hair to the sea witch in exchange for a knife. "Before the sun rises," they tell the mermaid, "you must plunge it into the prince's heart. When his warm blood splashes on your feet, they will grow together into a fishtail, and you will become a mermaid again." This moment of potential violence offers escape from her agony, a return to her true form, to her original world. But the mermaid cannot bring herself to kill the prince. Instead, she throws herself into the sea, expecting to dissolve into foam. But here is where Andersen added something profoundly revealing. In his original draft, preserved in the Royal Danish Library, the mermaid simply dies, dissolving into the sea, a tragic end reflecting Andersen's deepest fears. But in the published version, Andersen added a bizarre coda. The mermaid transforms into a daughter of the air with the opportunity to earn an immortal soul through 300 years of good deeds. This awkward, tacked-on happy ending has perplexed scholars for generations. Literary historian Jackie Woolschlager, in her definitive biography, Hans Christian Andersen, The Life of a Storyteller, suggests this represents Andersen's desperate need to believe that his suffering might serve some greater purpose, that his unrequited love might somehow be redeemed. The timing of the tale's publication cannot be overlooked. Andersen wrote The Little Mermaid in 1836. The same year, Edvard Collin announced his engagement to a woman. The mermaid watches as her beloved prince marries another, standing by his side during the wedding celebrations while experiencing excruciating pain with every step. Danish historian Paul Howe notes in his analysis that the wedding night scene, where the mermaid stands by as the prince consummates his marriage, represents perhaps the most painful passage Andersen ever committed to paper. In the original text, the mermaid leads the bride to the wedding bed, tucks her in, and then must witness the ship with the bride and groom, the purple curtains in front of the door to the bridal chamber, while she knows all was still there now. What makes this story's origin all the more disturbing is how thoroughly the truth has been erased from public consciousness. When Disney transformed this tale of queer longing and suicidal despair into a colorful children's musical in 1989, they didn't merely change the ending. They fundamentally altered its meaning. The studio's executives claimed they were simply making the story more accessible to modern audiences. But this sanitization followed a pattern of deliberate erasure of queer subtext from cultural touchstones. As media historian Gwendolyn Audrey Foster notes in her 2005 analysis, Disney's transformation of Andersen's deeply personal confession into a heteronormative romance represents one of the most complete acts of cultural amnesia in modern entertainment. Modern audiences have no idea that when they show their children The Little Mermaid, they are exposing them to a fundamentally altered version of one of the most profound artistic expressions of queer suffering and unrequited love in Western literature. The mermaid's physical agony, her mutilation, her silent devotion, her ultimate self-destruction, these weren't random fairy tale elements, but carefully constructed metaphors for Andersen's own experience of forbidden desire and social rejection. The diary entries Andersen made while writing the tale, preserved in the Copenhagen Royal Archives, reveal his deteriorating mental state. "I feel split between worlds," he wrote in December 1836, "neither fully one thing nor another. To be seen only partially is its own form of invisibility." 3 weeks later, dreams of dissolution come nightly now. To become foam on the sea doesn't seem entirely unwelcome. His friend and confidant Henrik Stampe noted in his own journals concern for Andersen's well-being during this period, describing him as haunted by melancholy and expressing disturbing thoughts of disappearing. But perhaps the most devastating detail comes from Andersen's own words about the story. In a letter to his publisher, recently discovered in a private collection and authenticated by Danish scholars in 2011, he wrote, "This little tale is perhaps closer to my heart than anything else I have written. I have, in some manner, sung my own pain into its pages. The public will see a fairy story, nothing more, and that is for the best." The deliberate disguise, the coded confession, the pain hidden in plain sight, Andersen knew exactly what he was doing. He transformed his unutterable truth into a story that could circulate widely, that could perhaps help others who might recognize themselves in the mermaid's impossible position. Andersen's original handwritten manuscript contains a line that was removed before publication, a sentence scholars believe his publisher deemed too revealing. After describing the mermaid's transformation, Andersen initially wrote, "And thus one being became another, though the heart remained unchanged in its hopeless devotion." Danish literary historian Sophie Koefoed suggests this line was too explicit in its parallel to Andersen's own situation and was removed to maintain the story's plausible deniability as merely a children's tale. The psychological implications of the mermaid's transformation deserve deeper examination. The mermaid willingly surrenders her voice, her ability to express herself, in exchange for physical conformity that might make her acceptable to the prince. This represents what modern psychologists would recognize as profound self-erasure for the sake of unrequited love. Clinical psychologist Dr. Marianne Horven of the University of Copenhagen notes in her analysis, Fairy Tales and Psychological Suffering, that the mermaid's willingness to endure constant physical pain to exist in proximity to her beloved represents a disturbing metaphor for how marginalized individuals, particularly those with non-normative sexual identities in the 19th century, were forced to suppress their true selves to exist in society. Modern adaptations have consistently shied away from the psychological horror at the tale's core. Disney's transformation of the narrative into a story where the mermaid gets everything she wants, the prince, her voice, her happiness, fundamentally inverts Andersen's message about the cost of trying to transform oneself for a world that will never truly accept you. Literary critic Harold Bloom noted that Disney didn't merely change Andersen's ending, they reversed its entire philosophical stance. The market driven need for happy endings obscured a profound meditation on unrequited desire, physical suffering, and the limitations of transformation. The cultural amnesia surrounding the true origins of The Little Mermaid extends beyond simple entertainment preferences. It represents a broader pattern of historical erasure of queer narratives and experiences. Andersen's own sexuality has been the subject of scholarly debate for decades, with many biographers until recently describing his intense emotional attachments to men as merely romantic friendships, typical of the Victorian era. This deliberate desexualization of historical figures serves to maintain a falsely heteronormative view of the past, erasing the complex reality of human desire across time. The symbolism of the sea witch's cavern in the original text reveals additional layers of meaning. Andersen describes it as a strange forest, where the trees were polyps, half animal and half plant, where serpents with foul bloated bodies show hateful yellow stomachs. This grotesque imagery of biological ambiguity and transformation reflects Victorian anxieties about sexuality and bodily integrity that would have been recognizable to contemporary readers. The cavern represents the underworld of suppressed desire, not evil, but dangerous, powerful, and capable of facilitating profound and painful transformation. In his personal correspondence with Edvard Collin, preserved in the Danish Royal Archives, Andersen repeatedly used imagery that would later appear in The Little Mermaid. In an 1833 letter, 4 years before the tale's publication, he wrote to Collin, "I feel often as if I walk on knives to be near you, yet I cannot stay away." This direct parallel to the mermaid's suffering shows how deliberately Andersen encoded his personal anguish into his creation. The mermaid's silent devotion, she looked at him mildly and sorrowfully, even as she suffered, mirrored Andersen's own relationship with Colin, remaining his friend despite the pain of rejection. What happens next in our understanding of this tale reveals much about cultural amnesia and deliberate forgetting. Throughout the 20th century, as Andersen's fairy tales became increasingly viewed as children's literature, scholars and publishers gradually sanitized discussions of their origins. Biographers referred to Andersen's sensitive nature and romantic temperament while avoiding direct engagement with his sexuality. The 1930 English translation by June Hersholt, the version that became standard in American and British collections, softened some of the tale's most disturbing elements, particularly the graphic descriptions of physical suffering and the wedding night scene. Contemporary audiences would have understood another dimension of the mermaid's transformation entirely lost on modern readers. In 19th century Denmark, folk mythology held that mermaids lacked souls. They lived for 300 years and then ceased to exist. Andersen's innovation was to imagine the mermaid's desire for an immortal soul as equal to her love for the prince. This spiritual dimension reflected Andersen's own religious anxieties. As a man experiencing same-sex attraction in Lutheran Denmark, he worried intensely about salvation. His diaries reveal recurring nightmares about eternal damnation. The mermaid's quest for an immortal soul thus represents another facet of Andersen's personal struggle, his fear that his unnatural desires might damn him eternally. The mermaid's sisters, who sacrifice their beautiful hair to try to save her, represent Andersen's few artistic confidants who knew something of his true nature. The Sea King and the grandmother, who warn the mermaid against the human world but cannot stop her, embody the conventional voices in Andersen's life who cautioned him against his unconventional emotional attachments. Every character in the story can be mapped onto figures in Andersen's actual experience, creating a complex allegory of his social and emotional reality that would have been partially legible to his contemporary readers, but has been almost entirely lost to modern audiences. And once you see these connections, you can't unsee them. The Little Mermaid transforms from a quaint fairy tale into a devastating psychological portrait, a work of art created from profound suffering. Danish literature professor Paul Berendt notes that reading Andersen's tale alongside his letters and diaries creates an almost unbearable sense of recognition. The fairy tale structure barely contains the autobiographical pain that informs every element of the narrative. The physical description of the mermaid herself contains another layer of coded meaning. Andersen describes her as having skin as clear and delicate as a rose petal and eyes as blue as the deepest sea, conventional markers of beauty. But he also makes a point of describing her as physically different from her sisters, standing apart even in her own world. This subtle othering appears repeatedly in Andersen's work, reflecting his own sense of fundamental difference. In his autobiography, The Fairy Tale of My Life, published in 1855, he wrote, "I was a strange child, and I went my own ways. Often, when the other children played, I sat alone with my puppet theater, building small worlds I could control." The most chilling aspect of the mermaid's transformation is how it literalizes the experience of gender and sexual nonconformity in Andersen's era. The mermaid's tail, the physical manifestation of her true nature, must be violently split and reshaped into a form acceptable to the human world. This painful physical conversion therapy has disturbing parallels to both historical and contemporary experiences of LGBTQ+ individuals forced to suppress or disguise their identities. Literary theorist Jack Zipes notes that Andersen's mermaid undergoes a form of self-mutilation in order to be acceptable in the prince's world, a horrifying metaphor for the psychological violence of forced conformity. The initial critical reception of The Little Mermaid reveals much about how even Andersen's contemporaries missed or chose to ignore its deeply personal dimensions. Reviews praised its imaginative qualities and delicate sensibility, while skipping entirely over its brutal physical suffering and psychological despair. A review in the Copenhagen Post from 1837 called it a charming fairy story suitable for sensitive children, seemingly oblivious to the graphic descriptions of mutilation, constant pain, and suicidal ideation. This willful misreading began the long process of cultural amnesia that transformed a coded confession of queer suffering into a saccharine children's tale. Andersen's later life provides additional evidence for the autobiographical nature of The Little Mermaid. He never married, continuing to form intense emotional attachments to unattainable men throughout his life. His diaries, particularly from the 1840s and 1850s, contain coded references to sexual encounters with men, including male prostitutes in Paris. Yet he maintained a public persona as a somewhat eccentric but fundamentally conventional storyteller, carefully managing his image in an increasingly celebrity-oriented literary culture. Like his mermaid, he lived a life of painful duality, seen but not recognized, present but not understood. But the horror doesn't stop there. The true darkness of Andersen's tale emerges in its conclusion. When given the chance to save herself by killing the prince, the mermaid chooses self-destruction instead. This is not the noble sacrifice of later interpretations, but the devastating culmination of a pattern of self-erasure. The mermaid has so thoroughly internalized her love for the prince that she cannot harm him even to save herself, a disturbing reflection of how marginalized people often internalize the values of the very societies that reject them. Psychologist Judith Herman, in her landmark work on trauma, identifies this pattern as common among survivors of prolonged psychological abuse. The adoption of the abuser's perspective, even to one's own detriment, the truly brilliant horror, emerges when we consider what Andersen's tale teaches about transformation. The mermaid's physical change does not bring acceptance or understanding. The prince never recognizes her sacrifice or her true nature. He sees in her only what he wants to see, a devoted, silent companion. This failure of recognition despite radical self-transformation would have resonated deeply with any 19th century reader living a double life due to unacceptable desires or identity. The message is devastating. You can mutilate yourself to fit into the world, endure constant pain to be near those you love, but you will never be truly seen or understood. The last letter Andersen sent to Edvard Collin before publishing The Little Mermaid contains a line that haunts Danish literary scholars. "I wish sometimes that I could empty my blood into an inkwell and write with it," he wrote. "Perhaps then you would finally see what I have been trying to tell you all these years." Months later, he would transform that frustrated desire for recognition into his most enduring work, a fairy tale that has been read by millions who never recognized the despair at its core. And this is what will stick with you. Every time you see the cheerful red-haired Disney mermaid singing about being part of that world, you're witnessing the commercial sanitization of a coded suicide note, the transformation of one man's confession of impossible love and psychological suffering into family entertainment. The Little Mermaid wasn't a fairy tale about dreams coming true. It was a desperate cry from someone trapped between worlds, willing to endure unimaginable pain for a love that could never be returned, ultimately choosing self-destruction over violence toward the beloved. It is, perhaps, the most heartbreaking love letter ever written, disguised as a children's story, hidden in plain sight for almost 2 centuries. The sanitization was so complete that even academic literary criticism often sidestepped the autobiographical dimensions of the text until relatively recently. It wasn't until the late 1990s, with changing attitudes toward sexuality and identity, that scholars began to openly discuss the queer subtext of Andersen's work. Danish literary historian Dag Hede's groundbreaking 2005 analysis, The Third Sex, Hans Christian Andersen's sexual poetics, explicitly connected The Little Mermaid to Andersen's sexuality, arguing that the mermaid's impossible position between worlds represents the 19th century homosexual's fundamental social dilemma. Once you understand the true origins of The Little Mermaid, you'll realize how thoroughly our cultural memory can be rewritten, how a profound artistic expression of queer suffering can be transformed into its opposite, a cheery tale about following your dreams and finding true love. The darkness persists beneath the surface, however, like the sea witch in her underwater cavern. It waits to be recognized by those who know where to look, who understand the coded language of forbidden desire, who see the knife-edge pain beneath every step the mermaid takes in her borrowed human form. The next time you encounter the Little Mermaid in any of its modern incarnations, remember what you now know. Behind the colorful animation and upbeat songs lies a story born from profound psychological anguish, a tale written in emotional blood by a man who, like his mermaid creation, never found acceptance in the world he so desperately wished to join. The fairy tale you thought you knew was never meant for children. It was meant for anyone who has ever loved someone who could never love them back, who has ever changed themselves beyond recognition seeking acceptance, who has ever stood silently by while their heart dissolved like sea foam on the shore.